Oh, I hear you now, and I see you. Well, good morning. This is PVK on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. Last week we did it in a little room with people and cameras on. We're doing it old style this week. Joey talked about the fact that when we do it we can do it in a bigger room on the Discord server with cameras off. And then people tend to hang out after the show, usually for a few hours, and it's kind of an important space for the Discord server. Everybody's actually in a different room right now. They're all up in the, this is what the Discord server looks like from the inside. They're all up in the Voice One high bandwidth room, talking the nonsense that they talk about. But there's just a few of us down here. D-Dot is here. Jacob is here. Jean Cavalier is here. And Grim Grizz gets the first question, and I'm not going to answer this question, Grizz. Yes, it's just too hard. What is body, spirit, mind, and soul? And what is an example of free will mechanically playing out through those parts? That is such a John Vervaeke question. That is you go over to the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord on the question and answer with John Vervaeke, and you ask him stuff like that. Me? It's just too... No, it just hurts my brain too much today, Grizz. So I'm going to pass. Cloud SFP 2.0. If I get warmed up, maybe I'll come back to it, Grizz. Who knows? But I got to get warmed up. Hello, Paul. I've enjoyed watching many of your videos and would like to thank you for all your insight. You're welcome. My question is, what are your thoughts on Jonathan Pageau's take on weaponized compassion? I think he's right. You can, Jordan Peterson said in the Joe Rogan podcast too, you want both mercy and justice. And if it's all mercy, you don't have anything. If it's all justice, no one survives. So you have to figure out how to keep mercy and justice alive. And a lot of the weaponized, you see this stuff is so old. You see it with child rearing, the fact that we have the term spoiling for a child. You can spoil a child. You can spoil a child. Children need discipline, and because they have to internalize that discipline, so they have self-discipline. So yeah, no, he was right. He was right about that. It's a good video. Yes and no's. Matthew, recently I was listening to a song from Akira the Don with the title, Thank You, God. The part that got my interest was, what is the secret of our success? Well, I think it had to do with a basic American creed, because it never passed a pioneer's lips in this form. But if it had, I think he would have said something like this. I believe in my God, in my country, and in myself, and in that order. Many chats and corners have been turned to explore what does it mean to believing in God. Furthermore, what does it mean to believe in my country? And what can someone from Europe learn from Americans in that regard? It's an interesting question. The God and country thing is a difficult thing. You know, one of the things that Jonathan in one of our conversations admitted to is that he's a monarchist, and he's a monarchist in a different time than he's in a monarchist in a day when there are not many monarchies around. Well, why? Well, if you look at, let's say, the structure of ancient Israel, you have God, and then you have the prophet, priests, and kings all below, and they administer God's desire for the nation, and the nation embodies God's desire. Now, there's reasons why in the modern period that was sort of laid aside. The French Revolution wrestled with many things like that. You know, a history professor from my alma mater wrote Jesus and John Wayne, and whereas what she documents in that book is true, that people have their politics and their religion sometimes in messed up order, but politics and religion run on very similar wavelengths, and there are reasons for that. So even the separation of church and state that the United States pioneered in its Constitution, there are loose ends and fringes to that we are continuing to wrestle with. So, yeah, God first, then country, then myself. It's not a bad order. It's not a bad order at all, because you should sacrifice for your country and for the people that live around you. And God should come above country, because that's basically the correct order. Europe, well, what is Europe? So the English still have a constitutional monarchy that they've been working for a while, and there's some good arguments for that. A couple of weeks ago, I was reading quite a bit about Napoleon and the French Revolution, and just a lot of interesting history with respect to that. So there's a lot of sorting things out in terms of how we actually live our lives. And what can Europeans learn from Americans? I don't know. I'm not a European. The American experiment has been fairly successful in that we've, with the interruption of one tremendously bloody civil war, for the most part, we've managed to not kill each other. The English Revolution was no picnic. The French Revolution was no picnic. The history of Germany, the short history of Germany and Italy, it's very interesting. Nationalism is something we probably don't talk enough about. At the end of World War II, everyone was concerned about nationalism. Now nationalism has become so assumed, it's difficult for us to think in terms that aren't nationalistic. Will nationalism, there was a while that it was imagined that corporations and multinationalism was going to sort of put an end to nationalism. It gets harder to believe, I think, now than it was 10 years ago, when you look at all the anxiety surrounding, let's say, Ukraine and Russia. So God is the broadest category, and so it must come first in many respects. Country is, well, it's sort of a lesser category, far shorter lived, and so it comes second. And we are the shortest lived and the smallest, and so we come third. And I think, again, the American system of government, the American founders, being revolutionaries as they were, had a lot of suspicion in terms of what the kind of power that centralized government should have. And there's always a balance there that you have to keep. And that balance is the subject of a lot of political wrangling in the United States. So I don't know what Europeans will learn from Americans. I don't know what we have to teach. But thank you, ABC. What do you think of Peterson eating only lamb? That was Michaela and Tammy eating only lamb. I thought Peterson still ate beef and steak.
What about the symbolism?
The symbolism. Especially around Passover. Symbolism. Bring your symbolism questions to Peugeot. Hey, Paul, would like to know if there's any conflict with your African counterparts in your denomination in light of this tweet. Can the West learn from African theologians? Ghanaian theologian Kwame Byakaidu said, well, Christianity is thriving where we are, and it's waning where you are, so maybe there's something that could be helpful to all of you, and I'm sure there is. One of the very interesting moments in American church history was when the United Methodist bishops were meeting, and they were discussing same-sex marriage, and of course, everybody's all into multiculturalism until another culture says something that they don't think is right. And then multiculturalism goes out the window for the sake of what you think is right. And so the United Methodists have been trying to put aside the African bishop. Same thing has happened in certain Anglican communities. So, yeah, I think there are things to learn from theologians all over the world. The difficulty is trying to understand what they're saying and apply it to our own contexts. Africa had a long, painful lesson in European colonial powers and churches applying lessons from Europe. Europe used to say things like, well, we know how to do Christianity, so let's make the Africans do it our way. Now, the Africans don't have that kind of power over, and so perhaps Europe will listen, but we'll see. No, it's a great point. Any thoughts on the Jesus pair and the contemplative tradition in Christianity? That's a pretty broad question. Have mercy on me. It's been a part of Christianity from very early on. It's not going to go away. Pastorally, I often find that I mentioned this book in last week's live stream, Streams of Living Waters by Richard Foster. It's a good book in terms of trying to get a sense of how the different streams come together. And if you just, so basically he looks at this, the contemplative tradition, discovering the prayer-filled life, the holiness tradition, discovering the virtuous life, the charismatic tradition, discovering the spirit-filled life, the social justice tradition, discovering the compassionate life, the evangelical tradition, discovering the word-centered life, the incarnational tradition, discovering the sacramental life. Christ's church has all these elements, and I've mentioned this before. Tim Keller's professor at Gordon Conwell once made the observation that stuck in Tim Keller's mind, and he repeated it often enough that it would stick in my mind, that revival happens, or when revival happens, it seems like all of the streams really come together. So I think for a lot of people, there's some mapping of personality profiles onto the different streams, and people will tend to gravitate towards one stream or another. Yet fortunately, biologically, and this is sort of a hazard of the church grazing movement that has come forward, if families are, let's say, no longer attending a church, then you'll tend to get the streams getting overly purified, and they could always use some mixing. We learn that we need each other in all of those ways, and when they get unbalanced, usually bad things happen. So I think all the streams are good, and they should all flow together. Hi, Paul, long-time lurker, first-time asker. Well, thank you, Alex. Oh, I must have COVID. I actually just have a dry throat. I would consider myself agnostic with a pull towards Christianity. And as of last year, you can lump me in with the ortho-curious camp. Forgive the basic nature of this question. The basic questions are often the best. But where would you start someone on this journey? I've heard to read the Bible, immerse yourself in a community, etc., and everyone has their opinion on the matter. When I have no experience within a tradition or any depth knowledge of the Bible, almost all claims can sound equally valid. It feels hard to find a direction without first planting a flag in one camp and working from there, which may be the solution. But I don't want to move too far in any direction. Any advice is appreciated. This is some of the comments that I had on Michaela Peterson's conversation with Jonathan Peugeot and her conversation with that ex-mobster as well. It is tremendously difficult to start. And because of the diversity of churches And because churches have in our culture sort of rightly or wrongly been framed in a consumerist mode, and maybe therefore framed in the modes of these streams, that's also difficult. And so my advice is usually, well, this question is not too complicated at all. It's a very important question. The video I released today was basically just, give me input on the channel. What do you like? What don't you like? What advice do you have? One comment said, you get rather meta. And I think that's a very fair comment. And a number of people have suggested to me that I be more practical, or I do more videos that are explicitly practical. I always hesitate to do that in an abstract setting, because advice given into a non-contextual, non-specific environment usually just sort of floats off as gas. And so that's part of the reason why my channel has the shape it has, where I try to get a lot of context on the people I'm speaking with, because Rick Warren said this once, and I think he was exactly right. He said, to be specific is powerful. That means you get really close to the knitting. And that's where a lot of power lies. But yet the challenge that you express, Alex, is a very real one. And so my advice is usually this: if you have a friend that you respect, start there. Ask your friend who you respect if you can go to church with that friend. Now, you don't have to join that church by any means, but just start there, because the difficulty is that the task is so enormous. It's very difficult, which is precisely your question, to know how to begin. And so, and I know some of the personalists around this channel will cheer at this blatant appeal to personalism, but start with a friendship. Most people will, if someone comes up to them and says, "Can I go to church with you?" Part of it is that they might even feel a little embarrassed about their church. They might say, "I don't know if my church would appeal to you, but of course you can come with me. And I'd love to introduce you to my friends." I've made this comment before too, so that you can't learn hockey by watching YouTube. Now, someone said, "You really do learn hockey by watching." Yes, but there's usually a lot of watching. It's usually I do, you watch, I do, you try, I watch, you do, I critique. That's sort of a learning phase. In other words, if someone never touches ice or puts on skates or has a puck or a stick, or with baseball, if you never touch a baseball or put on a glove or swing a bat, you might study YouTube videos all over the place, but you will never claim to play baseball. So the way to, another one. Two. Oh, well, thank you, both of you. Well, your handwriting's fine, Rick. Rick's handwriting is just fine. See, we are so old school here. We even do super chats on paper. That's how old school we are. So if I forget to answer these questions, forgive me. I'm sure the people in the Discord server will be a little bit annoyed if the super chat jumps the line. The way to get into it is to practice it. Again, you can watch pianists on YouTube all day long, but until you get your fingers on the keys, on the keyboard, you're not going to learn. And so you're going to have to do it badly for a while. You might have to do it badly for a long while. And so you can start by going to church, but going to church alone until you make a friend whose life you know, at least to a degree, you don't have that tactile reference. So ask a friend, say, can I go to church with you? Do you go to Bible study? I want to go to your Bible study with you. And just be upfront with your friend. Say, I don't know that I'll stay in your Bible study. I just want to get a sense of it. And so talk to your friend about the church before you get there. Be in church together, experience at church together. And then when you're leaving church, ask questions of your friend about what happened. And all of that will begin the growing process for you. And you'll probably begin to make new friends there. And so then ask them questions. And I often recommend it's to go to a small church if you can. Now, in some ways, mega churches and big churches have their systems down. Well, you'll go and you fill out your little name in a book, and then they might connect you. Someone might give you a call and connect you to a Bible study, and that's all fine too. But basically, just as with hockey or piano playing or so many things, you have to do it to learn it. And the doing will naturally sort of put the learning in order. And that isn't to say that there aren't great books you can read. That isn't to say you can't learn from anything from YouTube, all of that. But your life itself will order the sequence. So when you listen to Jordan Peterson talk about learning to read or learning language in terms of proximal development, the zone of proximal development, if you do things, it will maximize that zone of proximal development. We talk about this with just-in-time learning, all these kinds of things. So that's my advice, which is go to church, find a Christian friend, ask questions, and then go from there. And eventually the journey will begin to form itself. You might go to a church for a while and discover the church doesn't suit you. It doesn't fit you. And then someone at church will say, well, maybe you should try this other church that I've been to, or this other preacher. And then you can say, would you go with me, at least for the first time, to that church? Sure, I'd love to. And you're building community. It's just-in-time learning. It's far more interesting and engaging. And the learning that you do, because it's so connected with your life, you will keep. Rather than if you read a book, unless you've got super comprehension and retention, if you read a book, most of the time that you spend in that will be lost. So that's usually my advice. Chad the Alcoholic. How is it that most of us, even the secular, seem to go through life conveniently evading the inevitability of death? How is it that we're not crippled every day by the coming end? I'm just stuck in this lately from working in the old folks' home and in the quiet terror of that place. So last night I watched the Netflix movie Don't Look Up. And of course, the movie is about climate change. But the movie, I think, can be much more easily seen as a story about death. The reason we don't think about death much is because of our success and our affluence at hiding it away. I'm a big believer that children should have pets. And people will be like, why? Like, get them a guinea pig. Guinea pig's a pretty easy pet. It's kind of a fun pet. But guinea pigs die. Right away, your child is going to learn about death. We've covered up death. It used to be not too long ago that, let's say, when grandpa died or something, they would lay grandpa out in the house. That's why they call them funeral homes. And, you might be sleeping upstairs and grandpa's down there in the living room, dead and cold for a day or two. And, I've had people in my church who are old enough to have stories and experiences like that. Now today, well, that traumatizes them. Yeah, but part of growing is trauma. I'm going to talk next week with Eamon and Catherine about trauma. And you need little traumas in your life in order to grow strong, just like your bones and your muscles need little traumas in order to grow strong. Too much trauma and, your bones break or your muscles tear, but you need little traumas. And so the way we treat death doesn't help us recognize the fact that we live in the age of decay and none of us get out of this world alive. Death is a part of this world. How are we going to face it? People face it poorly. We're in this culture, we're not even facing aging. So, yeah. Dear Paul, in what degree do you think C.S. Lewis, imagination and fairy stories will play in building bridges of meaning for people? My sister-in-law, with the world of Lord of the Rings, has resistance towards Christianity, is in love with the world of Lord of the Rings, but has resistance towards Christianity. What can I do to help her? Let her be. I've heard it said that, if the communists really wanted to win, they would have had to completely get rid of Russian literature because there was so much Christianity saturated in it. It's the same with Tolkien. Let it do its work. Christians can be too anxious, too impatient, too hurried with the unbelievers in their lives. Love them. Love them well. In my experience, coming to Christ is something that is full of fits and starts and episodes, often because of a crisis. When a crisis arises, don't overfunction. Let the reality of a crisis sink in with people. Codependence is basically it's sort of overfunctioning. The work that Tolkien is doing, it's a pretty significant reference to Lewis and Tolkien in the Jordan Peterson Joe Rogan conversation towards the end of the towards the end of the podcast. Let it do its work. Our culture is so allergic to tribalist propaganda that Christian tribalist propaganda is often unhelpful. Take your time with people. Take your time. Pray for them. Love them well. And when the time is right and they need something, what you're living will probably be the first thing that they look to. This is especially true of people who have left Christianity and are trying other things. Well, they're going to try other things for a while. But people aren't dumb. And they will remember what has been placed in them and leave it to God. Mountie Jake, thanks for the mention of my Jehovah's Witness heresy. Now I'm an ex-Jehovah's Witness. Well, there you go. Bob Briggs. Oh, he's answering Alex's question. Why not attend a few liturgies at a local Orthodox church? Yep, that's fine. We will answer the questions, comes from study, but it might be from that experience as a better teacher. Experience a liturgy or 3. Let Christ guide you. It might not be there for you. It was for me. But who am I to tell you what Christ wants from you? That's true. You know, when I was listening to the Michaela Peterson conversations with Peugeot and with the ex-mobster, she's living in Nashville. Odds are she's probably going to go to a popular church with lots of people and big music. Lots of churches like that in Nashville. I bet you the quality of music in Nashville churches, in terms of evangelical churches, is way above average, just because it's a musical town. And grew up in a dispensational denomination. For a while was in a charismatic, so the dispensational denomination probably had 19th century English hymns, maybe some Gaither stuff, evangelical music. Then he went for a while, he was in a charismatic church. They probably had more, especially him being in Australia, probably had more Hillsong stuff. He's now settled Anglican, you know, quite liturgical. And he loves it. It varies so much from person to person that people have to sort of find their way through. So yeah, go to an Orthodox church, go to a Catholic mass, visit a big box evangelical church. But again, right away, depending also on your temperament, some people love novelty and they're bold people, and so they'll just walk right in a church, and they're extroverted. They'll walk right in a church. They'll visit. They'll shake hands with all kinds of people and make friends the first week. A lot of people aren't that way. A lot of other people are more introverted, and they'll come in and they'll look around and they'll be a little nervous, and someone will hand them a bulletin and they sit down and they look and they watch. And it's sort of like the Ethiopian eunuch and the deacon Philip. The Ethiopian eunuch is reading from the book of Isaiah, and Philip says, "Do you know what you're reading?" And he says, "How can I know if someone doesn't explain it?" That Ethiopian eunuch was a very smart man. So, yeah, definitely try other places. And if you have friends, if you have multiple friends that go to different churches, go to a bunch of different churches with your different friends. That's optimal, because again, you can ask your friend, something will happen in the service. You can say, what was with that thing? And they'll explain it to you. Otherwise, if you go by yourself, you go to a service, something weird happens, who do you ask? Now, again, if you're extroverted, you can go up to someone and say, "Can I ask you a question?" But then you've also got the randomness of that other person that you're asking. So that's why, again, it's nice to have someone sort of lead you through it and explain it to you. Wellesley and Whitefield. Hi, Paul. I've heard about God number 1 and God number 2, but have not dived into your videos to understand the concept, as I think discussion about them is peppered through a few of them. Yeah, some of the feedback today on my video also, the Andromedist noted the Andromedist. No, it's not. It's the Anadromist. I'm so freaking dyslexic. The Anadromist noted that it's too much insider language sometime, and that's true. I'm going to ask a question and see what happens. Could be a dud. John 14, verse 16, which is following most appropriate substitution. God number 1 is love. God number 2 is love, or God number 1 and 2 are love. God is love. 1 John, from 1 John, God is love. God number 1 and God number 2 are boxes on a conceptual workbench of mine to explore dualities in the conceptualization of God in the culture. That terminology first arose when I was watching the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversation in Vancouver, the first one where Brett Weinstein was with them. And it became quite obvious that when Jordan Peterson talked about God in the way that he did, and Sam Harris talked about the God that he's been pushing back on against, and the way that he did, we're really talking about two very different things. And I could recognize both things. And so, since part of the reason that it's so difficult to figure out what I'm talking about when I talk about God number one and God number two is that the conceptualization has continued to evolve over time. And that's why I say these are sort of like two baskets or boxes on a conceptual workbench. In the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris conversation, it was very obvious that God number one that Peterson was talking about was impersonal. And God number two that Sam Harris was complaining about was personal. And from there, I began to explore the whole born again movement and Charles Colson, and I made a bunch of videos about that. My conversation with Yosef recently, he challenged me on my use of immanence and transcendence, and I think he had some good points. In some way, I would often frame it, I looked for a biblical passage that might help connect this, and it might also sort of ease Christians listening, because when I talk about God number one and God number two, Christians immediately start to get a little anxious because are you saying, what are you saying? Are you saying there are two gods? No. And then right away, people are like, God number one, God number two, God number three. Oh, the Trinity. No. Exploring in the conceptualization about God, certain dualities. So if you look at what I've talked about with respect to God number one and God number two, I've had a whole bunch of dualities that I've explored through it. So in many ways, God number one, at the beginning, God number one, impersonal. God number two, personal. God number one, general revelation. God number two, special revelation. God number one, immanence. God number two, transcendence. God number two, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. God number one, the whole earth is full of his glory. God number one is arenic, agent-arena relationship. God number two, agentic. God number one tends to be feminine. God number two, masculine. And that was sort of where a recent video that I ended up on, and I still want to get back and explore that someone also made a comment in the videos today that I start things and don't finish them, and definitely guilty as charged. Sometimes, so my channel is in many respects a vast learning workshop for me. And it's just fun that y'all come along for the ride to learn with me and learn other things, and sometimes learn things different from me. And that's all totally fine. The masculine, maybe it's because I'm a man, the masculine is, I think, easier to see than the feminine. Now, again, if you listen to the recent Joe Rogan, Jordan Peterson podcast, Jordan Peterson made the point that 10% of women are more masculine than 50% of men. And 10% of men are more feminine than 50% of women. And the point he was making with that was that masculine and feminine, while they have relationships with male and female, it's not anywhere near a one-to-one correspondence. It's easier to see the masculine. Masculine is very agentic. Feminine is very arenic. Jonathan Peugeot, in his conversation with Andrea with the Bangs and with Mercury, when I make the video about masculine and feminine, I'm very much going to use a lot of that clip. It's already on my Vanderclips channel. Peugeot rightly says that the feminine directs attention. And I think that's right. In my Sunday sermon, which deals with the woman at the well in John 4, I'm going to pick up an idea from Grim Grizz about the shadow matriarchy. And I'm going to talk about that. Because in my experience, women in communities exert influence and authority in ways different than men do. A lot of what's happened since in the feminist movements of the last century or so has been sort of a women wielding masculine power, which is fine because, again, women wield masculine power and men wield feminine power commonly, naturally, regularly. But the categories of masculine and feminine are not without their utility. And so part of where I left that last video on God number 1 and God number 2 is that in many ways, God number 2 masks or maps onto the masculine, and God number 1 maps onto the feminine in terms of the agent and the arena, which is, I think, why. So the Bible begins with the creation of the man and the woman in Genesis 1, and they're both made in the image of God, which means that the image of God contains both masculine and feminine. But then, especially in this very gender conscious age, conservative people often then sort of rush in very quickly and say, well, wait a minute. You have God the Father and Jesus specifically, and the Holy Spirit to a degree, but God the Father and Jesus are masculine. And so then you have all this talk about the divine feminine, which I don't really know what people mean when they say that. If they mean the part of God, the part of the image of God that gets expressed in the feminine, okay, I understand that. But then you have all this talk about addressing God with female pronouns, et cetera, et cetera. How does that work? I think if we're addressing God the Father and Jesus as agents, the fact that we address them with masculine images seems absolutely right and appropriate. You generally address an agent. You don't generally address an arena in the same way. You address an arena. The arena is difficult for us to see and to understand. An agent gets localized. So there's all these tensions and these dualities. And so for me, God number 1 and God number 2 is a conceptualization that I'm using to explore those dualities. So that's, and I know that there's lots of other ideas about that. I think Manuel has some good ideas about that. And so Manuel was talking about emanation and emergence and mapping that onto God number 1 and God number 2. And that was an idea that I hadn't thought about. So that got me thinking, and it's difficult to, hang on a second. Someone's smoking outside my door. It drives me crazy when they smoke outside my door. So if anybody wants to hijack the channel for 3 seconds, you can unmic and say something on the internet until Rick cuts you off. Yes, please don't smoke here when I'm here, Billy. That's so Billy is out there smoking and so wafts right under the door and fills up my office with smoke. So yeah, there's probably as full a treatment of God number one and God number two as I've done. And again, in the spirit of the channel, it's an explorative process by which we, try to learn about God and learn about reality. So I don't know if anybody this week we're again doing the Bridges of Meaning question and answer in the big room. And we've got a nice group of, I don't know how many people. Whoops. Sorry, Rick, got to get out of the room. I was just going to count how many people are in that room. We have a room full of people and nobody says anything. People say things more when they have a camera. So anybody on God number one and God number two that's in the room want to say something?
Okay, I'll try. You seem to me, and I think Yosef agrees, to be rediscovering things that have been theologically developed over a very long time. And I think Yosef agrees with me. It would be a lot better if you would just adopt what theologians had been talking about.
I certainly agree that I'm discovering things that theologians have discovered over a very long time, because there's way more discovery that's happened over history than I can do in my lifetime. However, part of the utility of using different language is number one and number two aren't terribly threatening. If I use immanence and transcendence, even in my conversation with Yosef, immanence and transcendence, those terms are really complex. And I think just simply adopting those terms, perhaps without really fully understanding them, because I'm just grabbing the label, also limits discovery. So, and I don't know that I could, listening to Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, if I had just adopted those terms, and I did for a little bit, I said, well, Jordan Peterson's God is immanent and Sam Harris's God is transcendent. I don't think that would have helped as much or caught as much interest. So I understand what you're saying, but if I don't really understand all of the depths of the terms or their employment within all of the various traditions, then I think actually just simply grabbing onto those terms might in fact distort. So that's my answer to that.
So
go ahead, Manuel.
I want to add to that is that you want to have the exploration of the idea, and the participation with the idea is the thing that's fulfilling the idea in some sense, right? Like it's giving it its shape within you, and it's making the relationships and the connections, and those are the important aspects of the idea, not the fact that the idea exists.
I agree.
Yeah,
it's also the case that so much internet discourse about religion is just so tribally greedy. Gosh, we want Jordan Peterson to become Orthodox or Catholic or Jewish, or it's and so all of these words are flags in mapped out territories so that we can categorize each other, and there's a great amount of utility to that, but there's also a pinning in that happens there, which I think inhibits individuals from actually learning and exploring and engaging. And I think that's part of what the point that Manuel was just making. So I intentionally avoid using a lot of these terms, because even, for example, once after I self-designated as a Calvinist, then suddenly I have everybody's preconceptions of what a Calvinist should be to deal with. Whereas if I hadn't identified as anything, well, people would probably be wondering. But, being a minister in the Christian Reformed Church, it's hard not to identify as a Calvinist. So that's part of the reason for my strategy.
I think too, Paul, this goes back to the importance of, language and translation are related. And people think you can solve the language problem with the method of translation. But what reframing things like God 1 and God 2 does is reframe them so that people can understand them in the context in which we exist. Because to Manuel's point, although the ideas have been brought up, they need to be revivified within the context that people understand, because we've lost, you lose knowledge. You don't just gain knowledge over time. It's not like we understand all the things that Plato and Aristotle said and they've been, prescient for us forever. And that's why I like the God 1, God 2 conception, because it reframes things, right? The ideas are old, but now they're framed in a way that they're graspable by modern people. And I think that Peterson and Harris had bad framing, maybe good for them, but I can't keep track of those guys, right? So God 1, God 2 is something I can actually track.
And to add to that, like, the reframing also provides new contrast that the old terms didn't have, right? So the reframing might afford you the ability to make connections that aren't there in the tradition.
Well, and the definitions that people use are typically associated with the frame that they're coming from, right? So Jacob, and Joseph and me and whoever, right? We might be using the same words, but we're attaching the definitions to our particular frame, and then what we wind up doing is having a proxy battle over definition of terms. But what we're really arguing about is our frame, and you throw new vocabulary at things, and Mark, to your point, it opens up that conversation to where you're actually talking about the thing, right? Not arguing over the definition of the term that that your frame uses to categorize the thing, right?
Jacob, can I ask you a question?
Well, I don't mind if Paul doesn't mind.
Paul. It's either, or anyone can answer. What are
Andrea
the original?
is expressing the discord feminine. So go ahead, Andrea. Direct our gaze.
Hello. Yes. Hi. What is the original language that you would say prefer Paul to use from the past, and not imminent or transcendent? Like, what are the words that you had in mind from the past?
Well, like Yosef said, the Hebrew Bible uses Hashem and Elohim differently, and those are the places that we've placed these two different ways of looking at God.
What do those mean?
So Hashem is the Tetragrammaton. It's the name, the Yud He Vav He, and Elohim means power or God. It's mostly used for God in the Bible, but sometimes it's actually even used for people.
Okay. Well, that's it. I'm done. So take it away, Paul.
Thanks, Andrea. And quite honestly, Jacob, until you and Yosef brought it to me, I had never thought of playing with that mapping of God number 1 and God number 2 with Elohim and the Lord. And so so then now with that new framing and mapping, when I'm reading through texts and I notice usually Elohim is translated God in modern English translations, and Hashem is translated the Lord in many. So now I'm going to pay attention to that, and that's going to add a new layer of interest to my reading. So but if I I never, watching Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, I never would have imagined saying, oh, Sam Harris is talking about the Lord and Jordan Peterson is talking about Elohim. I never would have come to that watching Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. Did you think that when you first watched them?
First, I'm not sure you're assigning those correctly. I would say that it's more that Sam Harris was speaking of the Lord. But
Right. Did I say it backwards?
I think so. And I mean, for me, this division between these two it's very fundamental, especially in Hasidic philosophy. So yeah, I mean, the Irenic and the Agentic divide. I think there's a reason why Christine Hayes in her Yale course kind of starts out by describing that. I think this is a fundamental in understanding the Jewish God, that we are taking two things which seem very much opposed to each other and crashing them together to say this is our God who is both Irenic and Agentic.
She didn't in that course map Elohim to the Medo Divine realm and the Lord to something akin to an ancient Near East deity, though.
Yeah, I think that, so the documentary hypothesis people are very much, they seem to really believe in this thing that like different people had, the same texts in different ways, and it was some sort of different people coming together to kind of put them together, whereas I would say it is one unitary text which has taught this theme always and forever. And so I think part of that comes from the fact that she is an academic, and I'm guessing she finds the documentary hypothesis at least somewhat convincing.
Yeah, she follows it pretty closely. She continues to refer back to it in her course. So, okay, good. It looks like we have another one coming up too on God number 1, God number 2. OCD perfectionist nitpicker. Just by that, I'm terrified by the question. The Logos who laid down the law for his people, capital L law, capital P, capital H his, capital P people, unconcerned about mere words. I don't think I said that. Allow me to express my doubt. Duly noted. Not really a question. So we'll continue to Runaway. In your view, from what you know, what is the deal with circumcision? Would God number 1 or God number 2 ask this? Again, I just looked at Anselman's Anselman's comment in the thing. God himself is not divided. That's true. That's true. But yet we wrestle with understanding a God that is too vast for our comprehension to contain. And what that means is our vision is limited. Now, again, I know the danger, the problem of introducing God number 1, God number 1 and God number 2 is exactly this. That, well, which God asked? No, they're not divided. They're not divided. And how to conceptualize that is tremendously difficult. And I think that's part of the reason why you have masculine images and pronouns for God. Because when God is acting, I mean, it's almost a modalism, but I'm not mapping a modalism onto the Trinity. Okay. So, but you ask about circumcision. What is the symbolism of America doing this without why is the symbolism about America doing this without even knowing? Okay. Americans often circumcise their little baby boys, much to Andrew Sullivan's dismay and a whole group of other people who want to see an end to male circumcision of any kind. Circumcision is a very interesting thing in the ancient Near East. Greeks did not circumcise. Egyptians circumcised. Some of the tribes around Israel did not circumcise. Israel did not circumcise their children when they were in their desert wanderings. In a very mysterious passage, Moses' wife saves his life by quickly circumcising their sons on their way back into Egypt from the wilderness before Moses is about to deliver the people from Egypt. That's an interesting story. Just imagine that. Mom wakes you up in the middle of the night with a flint knife, cuts off your, talk about trauma. But there's the story. And I think that's a story that's ripe with symbolism. The fact that circumcision is introduced into the story with Abraham, I don't think is incidental. There's so much going on symbolically in those stories. Of all of the people God could have chosen to build into a great nation, he chooses a couple that is barren. And the symbol of covenant faithfulness involves a ceremonial beheading of the penis. Boy, is that pregnant with symbolism. Obviously, when it comes to the New Testament and the growth of the church in the Gentile world, circumcision is set aside. Why on earth, come the 20th century, 21st century in North America, do we continue to practice circumcision? I've told this story before. I was working at the church one night and the phone rang and I answered the phone. And it was a young man just happy to find a church where a pastor would answer the phone. And his earnest question for me was, "My girl, I have recently become a Christian, and my girlfriend says, in order to be a good Christian, I need to be circumcised. What should I do?" The inner troll in me so desperately wanted to give him an answer, but I refrained. There used to be, doctors used to make a case for circumcision on hygienic grounds. I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to fight that fight. I think it's simply a part of our cultural legacy that the people of Israel were circumcised. Americans have long thought of themselves as a chosen nation. You can find that in Puritan documents, and that got deeply into the American imagination, continued to hold sway in the American imagination through the 19th century, well into the 20th century, and it was really only in the 1960s counterculture that the opposition to that idea really got going, to the point now that certain people start crying about Christian nationalism in America as if it was invented by Donald Trump. And the fact that historians decry that would really make me pull my hair out if I had any, because you can't help but just listen to something like the Battle Hymn of the Republic and not notice America simply identifying as God's new Israel. And America has been doing this from the Puritan days. And I don't know if that's part of the reason why circumcision is part of the American ethos, but perhaps so. It wouldn't surprise me. But no, the symbolism around circumcision is amazing. Especially, one of the amazing things about the Hebrews. Here is a people that has, unlike a majority of peoples in the world, have rules against body altering. No tattoos, no eunuchs. But in order to be included in the tribe, the men, and the men only, have to undergo a painful surgery in one of the most sensitive parts of their body. It's an astounding thing. And I think the symbolism of circumcision has everything obviously to do with the penis, because the greatest threat that you could do to a person in the Old Testament was that they would be cut off. Well, what do you mean by that? Their future would be cut off. Well, in a world where there's the idea of resurrection has not yet come, you beat death with children and with lineage. And so the fact that circumcision becomes the predominant ceremonial, symbolic element of the people just, to me, makes perfect sense. So what a great question. And anybody in the chat room want to say something about circumcision? It's such a fun topic. I love bringing it up. Every time I bring it up in church, you just can see people squirm, and it's fun.
I think it's kind of gross that it's even like a thought. Like, why don't we just leave it alone? I don't know. It's
What
kind of
I'm
weird.
astonished.
There's an obsession with it, like, is it like a test of your masculinity? And also, I want to note, a lot of circumcisions were done when people were adults and they did it to themselves.
Yes.
So there's that too.
Think about that.
I got a big
Colossus.
problem with babies being strapped down. I mean, it's really awful. And I think that's what everybody's problem with it is now too. I had some friends, they had kids, and they were like, okay, time to circumcise the baby. And the doctor was like, you can't go in the room. And the mothers were like, what? Well, you're not doing it. Oh, well, ma'am, it's really, the hygiene and blah, blah, blah. They said all this stuff and they said, no, I got to be in the room with my child if you're going to cut on them. And they're like, no, ma'am, that's really not good. And they found out why. They strapped the baby down. It's horrible. So
It is
that's
horrible.
my 2 cents.
I
don't
completely
remember
agree
it
with
happening.
you. But and then the doctors, because I had 3 boys, and so I'm not gonna dox my sons in this, but then the doctors would say things like, well, at that age they don't feel pain, and it's like, what? That's just a complete lie. Of course they feel pain. And
Yeah, but you don't remember it.
No, you don't remember it. No, I agree. I agree. And so I'm not one of those people that
are a weird twist on remember and body.
Oh no! What is Grim gonna do with this? What on earth is he gonna do with this?
What I'm astonished about is how they figured it out. How did they figure out how to do this in a world that didn't have science? Like, that's what blows my mind. And how it's like, I'm assuming it's made its way into the scientific realm somehow, but like, it still blows my mind. How do these primitive apish people figure this out?
Well, there was a lot of botched circumcisions where it made them impotent. That's another thing that's not talked about.
Yeah.
Is that what happened to me?
Gosh. See, this is why circumcision is such a fun topic.
I hope you're joking. I hope not.
Well, I have a comment because I think Paul, when he's talking to the Church of Colossians, and he talks about like you should cut yourself off from them. What those people were doing was practicing a ritualized castration. So, like, Paul has real direct digs at this. I think that's why he's the perfect mouthpiece for it.
Wow. Yeah, circumcision. It's always a fun topic.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
Colossians is fun. Read Colossians with circumcision in mind, knowing
I
that
will.
in Colossians that's what they were doing, was actually ritually cutting themselves off from their future.
I will.
Yeah,
I will pay
I
careful
think-
attention to that next time I read Colossians.
But honestly, Paul, I think you might have found your title for the video here. Circumcision. Isn't it fun?
and the fact that the Jews have their clergy do it and everyone's around to watch. Glad
Yeah,
I'm Dutch Calvinist.
I would argue that like the fact that you've noticed how uncomfortable a congregation gets with this topic, like, is your red flag, right? Like, the fact that people cannot take their sense making that gets them through life in almost every other context and apply it to this one makes them uncomfortable because it's so obviously bonkers, right? Like, if your 16-year-old son came home one day and said, "Hey, I found a group that I really like, and they're interested in integrity and virtue and loving God," and you're like, "Well, that sounds great. There's just one thing I got to do. I just have to self-mutilate, right? My genitals, right? Your sense-making apparatus would obviously tell you that something is wrong, right? But because it's so baked in to the culture, we can't question it.
Well,
And
on that
also, a
point,
lot of
what about the
people were
cannibalism?
circumcised against their will. A lot of people in the audience are probably uncomfortable because they can't undo it. Maybe they want to, and then they make their son look like them because they don't want their son to be different. And so it's a vicious cycle, I think.
Yeah, and then you
And
get
the mothers are
publicly
stopping it, though.
what they prefer, right? You have women publicly stating that I prefer the circumcised penis, which like just makes the man a complete object.
Oh, that's not true. I mean, I know that might be popular, but in reality, no. They like the uncut version, man. Definitely.
Well, the one thing you just described before there about telling your parents is you basically just described the Heaven's Gate cult, which is quite creepy. I don't know if you've ever seen that documentary, but watch out for the cults, people.
Well,
Well, I
I've
would
got a
add, though,
question for
also-
Jacob. I want to know if, let's say, do adult converts to Judaism, do they have, if they are uncircumcised, must they be circumcised to fully join? And which churches can you become like Reformed Jewish and not be circumcised, or what's the lay of the land with that?
Even Reform still requires circumcision. Adults get circumcised all the time. And for me, so when I first started doing campus outreach, this is an issue because there's plenty of Jews who were not circumcised as children. And for me, advocating it, I felt a responsibility to actually see if what I was advocating is a good or bad thing. And I spoke to several men who were circumcised as adults. They told me made no difference whatsoever in their life. They could not feel any difference. And honestly, I think it's become a huge symbolic thing. But when you talk to urologists, like I have, when you talk to people who are circumcised as adults, like I have, it's a minor cosmetic thing that gets done. I know lots of people who perform circumcisions. Adult circumcisions are usually, I believe almost always, performed by urologists, but it's not the huge issue people have made it. And on the internet, the intactivists have made the whole thing so crazy. I mean, you make a video on circumcision and the intactivist squad will raid your comment section.
That's not true at all, man. I mean, there is a big difference. That we could get real graphic here, but I'm not going to. But there is absolutely a total difference and a biological function for you to have your foreskin. Okay, I'm just going to leave it at that.
I love it. I'm so happy with this conversation. This is great. I didn't wake up this morning thinking, boy, we're going to have a lively discussion about circumcision on the Discord today, but here it is.
The idea that I'm created in the image of God and that image is defective and needs to be corrected when I'm born sets the tone for the rest of my life, right? It's like you were so unacceptable when you were born that you needed to be physically altered.
So
right?
this is the funny thing, that this is for 2,000 years has actually been the theological thing in Judaism. Yes, that we believe that we as humans were created imperfect, and it is our job, and that's why circumcision is the emblem of Judaism, is the belief that human beings have a job to perfect the world, and a rejection of what we would say is the Greek naturalistic fallacy that you are perfect as you are. That is the symbolism of it.
Wow. Just wow. Well,
I have a small thing here.
Amen.
Hello?
Did you just say that in this conversation?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead. Did you want to say something, Yosef?
Yeah, I would just like to add one thing. So the
Just don't call it a small thing. Not right now.
I got it.
Oh, we just
There's a
lost you.
circumcision.
Oh, he just got cut off.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Just for babies, and the parents always are there if they're alive, and they're certainly not strapped down. Usually, one of the grandfathers, holds the baby in their lap, and it's a very communal event where everyone is there and sees it, and like it's not at all this kind of medicalized procedure. Even though the people doing the circumcision are trained very carefully, and like you have to qualify, and when you get too old, you get disqualified basically, because obviously you can't have shaking hands or poor eyesight. But like, it is not medicalized kind of sanitized procedure in a hospital the way that it's been described here. And this is true for Muslim circumcision as well, which is done at 13. Usually.
Get closer to the phone because you're coming in and out.
Okay. Not a great connection. I was just saying that for ritual circumcision for Jews and Muslims, this is not how this works at all, as far as this like kind of strapped down baby in a hospital without their parents.
Well, I think we'll bring this circumcision discussion to an end. So thank you all. This was fascinating. I've learned a lot. I love a good conversation. So thank you. All right, on to Yosef's question. What do you think of calling this little corner of the internet TLC? You mean like the Learning Channel? Learning Channel, Internet for short. Combating the darkness of the IDW with love and a hermeneutic of beauty. Oh, that's quite nice. It's quite nice. By the way, I loved your conversation with Dr. Jim. Yeah, it was a great conversation. Always is with him. What is the line between tragedy, frustrated telos, versus the modern lack of telos from heroes removed from the human condition versus biblical characters removed from the human condition? I know you brought up Jesus. What about Moses or Elijah? Elijah is not married to Israel. Is Elisha like the next Bond movie or something more generative? Oh, good question. Is Moses a tragedy? Moses gives birth to a people. Elijah and Elisha they're trying, this gets into the whole revolutionary question about Peugeot too, because the prophetic role is to call people back to covenant faithfulness. And so, are they heroes? Sort of like heroes. The story, well, gosh, this gets complicated. And I would love to at some point, we can't do it today, we don't have enough time, but I think it's hard to argue with the fact that the for the Christian Bible, putting this New Testament onto the Old is sort of a way to turn the Bible into a comedy. And, you know, I've got actually, well, maybe I should do a conversation with Jacob and Yosef together in a video. That would be fun. On this question of the form of the story, because my reading of the Hebrew scriptures is so deeply impacted by Jesus and the New Testament that I can hardly read it without reading back the new onto the old. And that's a constant complaint from Jewish scholars about Christian translations and Christian scholarship. So, but I would imagine that Rabbinic Judaism in some ways functions similarly, in that it too is an interpretive lens through which to read the Old. It's definitely true of the Mormons, the Latter-day Saints Church. It also happened in terms of, you know, Greeks and the, you know, church fathers, and that's a big discussion. Were the church fathers too Greek? There's a ton there. So yeah, all good questions. Tragedy of his leadership? No, I think that there's a definite element of tragedy in the story of Israel. And there's a longing in the story of Israel. The first temple is lost, and the second temple is not up to standard. And when you have that longing in the first century, of course, during the stories of Jesus, when will God redeem his people? When will God save his people? And keeping that longing alive for thousands of years, it's a powerful thing. WV, West Virginia Pilgrim. Do churches suffer from gated institutional narratives? Yes. If so, do they help or harm the church? Boundaries and fences and borders are necessary. You don't have identity without them, because identity is all about in, out. Yes, no. So one of the super chats by Chris, you know, has what you have learned in this corner of the internet affected how you counsel those in your church on a practical level? Most of the people in my church are in a very different place than most of the people I talk to on the internet. Now, the children of people in my church who no longer go to church are more like the people I talk to on the internet. But part of, well, I don't know if this is going to get me in trouble. Monday night, I had to go to a church in Ripon, south of here, and the congregation was having a vote on whether or not to leave the denomination. And I was just so struck by what a different world, how differently the world looks from within those walls and outside those walls. And that's not in and of itself a bad thing. That's exactly what walls are for. But if you read history in the United States up to the counterculture, Christian ministers had a role to play in public America. The counterculture dramatically shifted those relationships. And perhaps, you know, the the climax of that, perhaps, was, of course, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Reverend Al Sharpton. To a certain degree, African American pastors can continue to get away with it. It was significant that Rick Warren spoke at Barack Obama's inauguration. It was more significant that Giglio, another pastor who had written hymns, was disinvited from Barack Obama's second inauguration. Part of this is because the narratives have gotten so far apart that what churches spend a lot of their time focusing on is unintelligible to many outside the church today. That's a missional challenge and perhaps a crisis. And the division has only gotten greater in the last 20 years. And part of this is, I think, connected to the rise of Jordan Peterson. And again, people, I think, have rightly noted that it's probably true that Peterson could not have had the influence that he did have if, in fact, he had a confessional relationship with any specific church. This is a real problem for the culture, because our culture got to the place that it imagined it didn't need a religion. And what that really means is that the culture can't see its religion. And if you can't see your religion, you can't actually engage with the religion that is beneath you. And this was, this is beneath Jordan Peterson's attempt to talk to celebrity atheists. And of course, when Jordan Peterson would say, oh, you definitely have a religion, I mean, that was obviously an insult to people like Sam Harris. But obviously, part of the difference is, well, how do you define a religion? Do you have a worldview? Oh, yeah, I guess I have a worldview. Well, then you have a religion. No, a religion is a practice of a religio. Yeah, but you have one of those too. So churches are kind of in a bad space. Now, it is also not accidental that orthodoxy, of many of the traditions, orthodoxy can tend to be about have as high a wall and as different of a place as any religion around. I mean, it's so opposite to evangelicalism, which denudes its sanctuaries so that they're virtually undistinguishable from, let's say, a moderate-sized junior college. Just go onto the Willow Creek campus. So it looks like a junior college or a business park. Nobody would say that of an Orthodox church. A lot of this is the history of the emergent movement, because what happened in the late boomer period, when the seeker movement rose, where Bill Hybels was trying to create a safe space for a dangerous message, and in order to do that was creating churches that looked like junior colleges and business campuses. the next generation coming up basically said, if I go to church, I want to hear churchy stuff. And so the Orthodox, the rise of the Orthodox, is in some ways a response to that. Well, it's full churchiness, you know. You've got icons on the wall, you've got liturgy. Nobody's going to confuse an Orthodox worship service with a TED Talk plus music. I think so. A friend of mine has written a really powerful paper on what I think is the coming death of the Christian Reformed Church in North America. That doesn't mean that the churches are going to disappear, but the death of the denomination will mark an end to something that has been dying for about 50 years, especially since the end of the counterculture. To me, the real interesting questions are what comes next. And I actually think what we're doing in this channel, what we're doing in Estuary, what we're doing on this Discord server is a participation in what comes next. Because in some ways, what comes next will look a lot like the past, like Orthodoxy or Catholicism or Anglicanism or as Richard Foster calls, the sacramentalist tradition. But it will also have a lot of the future in it. And all of those lines will be in slightly different places. So, you know, the Orthodox, for all of their black robes and icons, have shown an amazing capacity for YouTube and the internet and podcasting. Isn't that interesting? So, yeah, there's gated institutional narratives, and a lot of these are going to die. The really hardy ones are going to live behind thick walls and probably continue to endure to one degree or another. But we live in very interesting times, and interesting isn't always comfortable. So, are some Christians predestined to reject Calvinism? Absolutely. There's a one-word answer. Rainman 57. I watched a portion of a Gospel Simplicity video where the guest, Dr. Neems, made a point to say that the interdenominational culture war social media space is mainly filled with Catholic or Orthodox voices. Another super chat from James Lee. Have a good lunch. Thank you, James. Interdenominational culture war social media space is mainly filled with Catholics and Orthodox voices and not much from Protestants. I guess, well, I don't know. Shoot. Evangelicals seem to be breaking out into all-out civil war. You know, just, you can't say Kristen Kobes de May, Jesus and John Wayne, David French, Neil Shenvey, and a civil war that James Lindsay shows up on conservative Reformed YouTube channels and podcasts. James Lindsay, former New Atheist, still atheist, posts podcasts about theology. I think we're all in on this one. Now, obviously, he must not be familiar with your channel. I do not aspire that this be a culture war channel, but I guess it's a war that you can't exactly completely avoid. But I am surprised because I see a lot of Protestant pastors. Absolutely. Just this morning, I found this video of Doug Wilson responding to the clip of Jesus and Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan that the Joe Rogan Experience posted on their YouTube channel. Another high-profile African-American Christian YouTuber responded to that video, and Jordan Peterson approved the message on Twitter and tweeted it out. So no, the Protestants are all over this. And I would say in many respects, it's more a Protestant war that Catholics and Orthodox are now combatants in, because the American culture war has everything to do with American Protestantism going all the way back to the Puritans and the New England Transcendentalists. America's been fighting this war for a very long time. And when basically the Confederacy was ground down and destroyed, you read George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture, the church that was seeded into the South came from the North. So, I mean, the victory in the Civil War was quite thorough. Now, of course, after Reconstruction, Jim Crow legislation emerged along with a bunch of other things. But no, this is Protestant through and through. Do you think Protestant voices are unrepresented in this corner of the internet? I think well, it's not true of the Catholics, but many of you who are going to Orthodox churches grew up Protestant. So what's a Protestant voice? No, I see Protestants fighting this war tooth and nail. And just see it, the main line. Look at it, just main line versus fundamentalist. I mean, there's the modernist fundamentalist fight is still echoing through, but now it's sort of changing, and in the degree to which the evangelicals are taking this up, and they're lining up on both sides. So no, it's all over the place. Second question. Oh, look, we're getting to the end. Ooh, I can finish today. Woohoo! No more questions. All right. Okay. Second question. Based on your videos, I am going through Northrop Frye's series on the Bible. I'm finding it very helpful in understanding my Catholic faith, even more so than from Catholic sources. See, that's Protestantism. This causes me to ask, how can we bridge more between strains of Christianity with regard to our understanding of Scripture? It's happening. It's happening. It seems more and more than the differences are vastly overstated. I don't know if I'd say that. But America has always had this impact. The roots of Catholicism and Orthodoxy go deep in the old world, but here in America, it's all going to be different. Once the Catholic Church, when Jordan Peterson in one of his videos suggested that, in a sense, to rephrase him, why don't the Roman Catholics simply resume their position at the center of the culture? That makes absolutely zero sense in terms of American culture. Now look at Quebec, look at France, look at Spain, look at Italy. But even Italy, you have to remember that when Napoleon marched into Italy, he conquered and put an end to the Papal States. It's not until the beginning of the 19th century that the Italian and German unification and nationalism is very, very recent. So the relationship between the Roman Catholic Church and France or Quebec is very different from the relationship between Protestant Christianity and governments like the American government, or even in a sense the British government or the English. I don't know what label to use, you folks in the United Kingdom, because is Scotland going to peel off, and the Irish left, and Y'all are a mess up there. I'm going to get over there and see it for myself one of these years. But in America, we are going to, I think we have an opportunity to do some different things than you can do in the old world. So what we've got going right now in this little corner of the internet, TLC, is an Orthodox apostle, Jonathan Peugeot, a Dutch Calvinist pastor, me, and a cognitive scientist out of the University of Toronto talking about God and religion and a meaning crisis. Wow. Wow. So I'm very interested to see what happens to the Orthodox Church in America. It's going to be fascinating. You know, I was watching, there's a Orthodox church in Oklahoma City. They have a good YouTube channel. Really, I was watching some classes they were giving on the Gospel of John. I found it fascinating. But of course, the Orthodox priest giving those classes used to be Protestant clergy. How many Protestant clergy are now in the Orthodox Church? Don't tell me that a Protestant clergyman coming from having grown up Protestant in America is not going to be in significant ways a bit different from those that have grown up in Greece or Russia or other places in the East. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying there's going to be differences. So, yeah, great question. But I think in America, we're going to be able to make progress on some of these things. All right, if I'm going to finish this up, I got to keep going. It seems to me, the more than anything, that the biggest blow dealt to Christianity in the West has been World War I and World War II. Oh, yeah. What do you think a war with Russia, oh my gosh, would do to our societies right now? You mean, please tell me no nuclear exchange. Death blow? It sounds like a nuclear exchange. You know, what's happened in Russia, and I'm by no means an expert on this, but who was it? Oh, it was Peterson on Joe Rogan when he said, he was talking about Israel and Egypt. He talked about, you know, when you leave tyranny, you go into the wilderness for 2 or 3 generations. I think Peterson's right. There's a wonderful little book by Philip Jenkins, not little, but a wonderful book by Philip Jenkins on the religious aspect of the First World War. It's a fascinating read. Those 2 wars changed Europe dramatically. You know, just in terms of specific religious participation in the United Kingdom. I mean, church participation fell off the map. You've got the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, where church participation falls off the map. Now, this had happened before. I noted when I was reading about, you know, prior to the French Revolution, there was a revival of the church in France. And so the church in Europe has had successions of ups and downs and highs and lows. We tend to look back with very low resolution and think, oh, back in the old days, everyone would go to church. No. In American culture, church attendance reached its peak during the Cold War. Not in the 19th century. What does that mean? We don't know. Can you judge what is the relationship between a culture and the religious aspect? Tremendously complex question. I don't know. I watched some videos on why the tension between Ukraine and Russia right now. And the argument the video was making seemed to be that Russia's concerned about NATO. I can understand that. And Ukraine was interested in, cozying up to the European Union. I can understand that. And Russia grabbed Crimea, got away with it. Russia's always had a problem with warm water ports. So the U.S. has been in a conflict with what is essentially Russia since the end of the Second World War. It's had different phases and evolutions, but I also saw that the economy of Russia is smaller than the economy of Italy. So present-day Russia, if you exclude the nukes, is not what the Soviet Union was. Germany is unified. Germany has not militarized for very real reasons and very recent memories, but Russia knows it's no match for Western Europe in many ways. Culturally, though, they seem to be punching above their weight class. Putin's a very cagey guy. So, but Europe, is Russia or Islam a bigger threat to Europe? I mean, just asking a question like that shows that we tend to see geopolitical and religious in different categories, but they're not. So, yeah, that's good questions. Simon Nelson. Hi, Paul. I'm trying to figure out my first personal grounding. In other words, the lens through which I experience and interact with the world around me. What would you say would be your first personal grounding? Hope the question makes sense. Boy, that's hard. Because when I think about first personal, I don't think about it in terms of a foundational image. I think first personal grounding tends to be phenomenological or experiential, but I don't know if that's the category you're thinking about. So I don't know if that helps. Chad the Alcoholic. Howdy, Paul. Have you had a chance to check out my song, Ontology for Dummies? I saw it. I'm thinking it's going to be a huge hit like the top 40. We're all going the way to the top, baby. Take us with you. I'll ride your coattails there, Chad the Alcoholic. I'll ride your coattails. Way to get a little product placement in the comments too. Ontology for Dummies on the Bridges of Meaning. What's that?
That's money, baby. Money.
Oh, Kingdom Kid. Read comment. You are part of my daily routine. I'm so glad to absorb your ideas and expand my thoughts on these subjects. Which archetype are you to your viewers or participants? Well, that's a good question. Which archetypes am I participating in? I think in some ways a teacher. I've always had a teaching bias. I'm sure I'm a father archetype for some of you because I'm old and I have a big beard and I have a deep voice. Remember one little kid comes up to me in church one day, he looks at me and says, "Are you God?" A delightful child. So, yeah, I don't know. And that's why I listen. I like getting your input because what on earth am I doing on this crazy internet thing? Dave 77. Hi, Paul. Do you think that the emergence of Sunday school in Protestant churches has done more harm than good? Wow. By instilling in young young churchgoers a simplistic, literal, superficial conception of the faith that they never managed to outgrow or deepen in adulthood. Well, that's certainly true of bad Sunday school. So Dave 77 is absolutely right that Sunday school is an incredibly important new ministry that came into the Western Church. I think it was simply part of the ongoing development of secular educational systems, and I think the church understood that if it wanted to not simply disappear, it needed to also do a degree of education. Now, in the Christian Reformed Church, for a very long time, we had catechesis, which was training in the Heidelberg Catechism. And so some of that slipped into Sunday school curriculum. A lot of evangelical Sunday school curriculum is just bad. It's moralistic. I think if you want to, I think you should teach children the Bible. And I think evangelicals have actually done that fairly well. Rod Dreher regularly on his blog would make the point that he'd look around and at least evangelicals knew their Bible. And I don't think looking at the Bible as a source of moral lessons, the symbology can tend to lean towards that at times. This stuff is tremendously difficult. You can find books in the Protestant world that in the 1950s was basically promoting school bus Sunday school ministries. Well, why? Because working parents liked trotting their kids off to school during the week and would really like to sleep in on Sunday. And so sign your kid up for Sunday school, and the kid goes to Sunday school in church, and mom and dad get the morning off. And that worked. So more harm than good? I'm not ready to say that. Bad Sunday school doesn't help. You can throw into this youth ministry. There's a lot of question about the shape of youth ministry and the shape that youth ministry has taken. But on the other hand, you can find people that have been blessed by it. So, yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a good question. I got these super chats here. I should probably see if there's any. Well, I think I answered most of these. So good. Hey, look at this. We have 7 minutes. So is there a question in the chat room that anybody wants to ask?
I may have one, Paul.
Okay.
It's hard to ask this question properly. Basically, how do you think about martyrdom, and what do you think is the proper way we should be thinking about it? Because it keeps coming up for me recently, like it's something that has more and more possibility of happening, but I'm not. How do I prepare for it?
Well, martyrdom always comes within a context, and this is something to keep in mind. So martyrdom in the early church happened because usually of some political struggle. Now, again, that's our category, because politics and religion were very much one thing in the Roman Empire. And so persecutions within communities happen because someone sees a particular group as a threat. When you look at, so early martyrdoms will focus on, let's say, Romans killing Christians. During the Protestant Reformation, you've got martyrdom stories arising among Protestant groups being killed by Catholics, and then some Anabaptist groups being killed by Protestants. A difficult martyrdom story is, of course, silence about. I think it's helpful to read as much history. If you're curious about this, read as much history as possible and try and find primary sources about it. A few months ago, I was reading Eusebius. Interesting work. Very much had a propagandistic edge. Certainly was trying to sway its readers in a particular direction. What makes you ask questions like this?
It's hard to say what specifically it is. It's more just a feeling I get just looking at, let's say, the direction that mainstream culture is heading. Not necessarily any like evidence. It's just a
I would try to go
coming up,
man. Because if you're afraid that somebody's going to kill you for your beliefs, like, walk away. I would suggest fight, but if you're not into fighting, which I understand, leave. That's what they did in Sodom and Gomorrah. Leave, don't look back, and get your family to a safe place, man. I wouldn't consider martyring yourself or even having a possibility of being in that situation. Get out of there.
I think
considering I live in the middle of America, it's it's something that may be very far off, if you put it that way. But
I think there are, if you read something like the death of Polycarp, one of the themes that comes out of early Christian martyr stories is Christians had an understanding that we shouldn't hold too tightly onto our lives, and that gave martyrs a particular power. The Romans found it tremendously unnerving, and this continues on through lots of epics of martyrdom. The Romans found it tremendously unnerving when the people who were being tortured, threatened, or killed didn't plead.
Yeah, it was stoic. It was kind of their own philosophy being thrown in their face, but used correctly.
Yeah, they didn't plead. And they didn't plead. I hear when I listen today, certain chatter, anxious chatter about martyrdom. If that anxious chatter is expressing an insecurity, I think it doesn't bear witness well. When you look at the model of martyrdom, the model of Christian martyrdom is, of course, from Jesus. And there was absolutely nothing insecure about the story of Jesus' passion and death. In fact, in some ways, you almost saw him in control of the process. Now, again, if you read biblical admonitions, and church admonitions, there is nothing wrong with leaving. There's nothing wrong with fleeing. I think the thing that needs to be avoided is the anxious insecurity that is very natural to us as human beings. An anxious insecurity, because Christians should believe that Jesus is Lord, and that whether he, in some ways, all Christian living is cruciform. We are all told to take up our cross, that's a very much a martyrdom posture, and follow him. So whether the self-denial is of a living sort, or if it is one that looks more like martyrdom, it should be still of a kind. And that kind is a security that whatever Christ calls us to is for his glory and for his kingdom. Now, I know that you can, let's say, if you're a preacher or a YouTuber or some kind of Christian leader, you can gain a big following, a lot of attention, making all kinds of noises about persecution. There's a guy I might have on my channel who's reached out to me. He recently did a hunger strike. He's not in prison or anything, but he basically did a hunger strike recently to draw attention to the persecution of Christians in India. Christians have been persecuted in China. I think there is a way that certain Christian leaders sensationalize this in order to build a big platform, draw a lot of attention, make a lot of money, try to accumulate political capital. And I find these sorts of things unbecoming, especially in a world where Christians in the Islamic world, in Africa, in India, in China, in other places of the world, who have far, far less power and far fewer resources than we do, bear witness to Christ with a lot of power. So I think if one is feeling anxious about martyrdom, the best way to respond to that in their life is to lean into your security and your calling in Christ. Enemies are going to do what they do. The one thing you should not allow them to do is separate you from the love of God. And if, in fact, we focus on our devotion and on our faithfulness, if persecution comes, it comes. But let us be found being faithful to our God and loving our neighbor all the way up to and including our enemies, even those who persecute us. Read the Sermon on the Mount. Pray for those who persecute you. And I think if we focus in that way, if persecution comes knocking at our door, we will, the word martyr means witness, we will be able to be a witness. And that's what we should aspire to be. So,
hey Paul, have you seen the film Hidden Light?
Seen the film what?
A Hidden Light?
No, I haven't seen it yet. I know it's a.
Oh my God, dude! So this anybody who's really like wondering, watch this film. I think it'll help address some of what you're thinking about, because I think the martyr, a real somebody who is talking about, they don't really have any choice in that. You know, like they're completely compelled, as you said, to love, you know, Zach loves. Yeah. But that film, unbelievably beautiful. Unbelievable.
All right. Rick says time to land the plane. So Rick's got to get back to his day job. Poor Rick, you know. He's got a day job now. So I can't see you, Rick. And I know you'd have to run back to your little office over there after you passed me the last super chat. Thank you, Chris. And so thank you all for joining us today and for your participation. And those of you who are on the Discord server, the after party will continue. So hang out, split up into different rooms, talk to one another, turn on the cameras, play those crazy little online games that you play sometimes, and have a wonderful afternoon.